Hey, we've been listening to President Trump's inauguration speech at the Capitol. Going back to our guest now, he did talk about American exceptionalism. Do you think that he struck a more optimistic tone than the last time?
I actually think that this was quite a bit like his American Carnage speech. I expected it to mean much rosier. It seemed like maybe there were two speeches happening here. The first part was absolutely kind of his same old hits, right? Immigration. He promoted this, well, let's call it what it is. It's a lie that immigrants are criminals, actually have lower crime rates than people who are born here. But this is really something that gained a lot of steam during his campaign. He went after the electric vehicle ban, said drill, baby, drill, so his kind of greatest hits on the environment. And then when it came to the economy, we heard kind of the same thing, that oil production, increasing that is going to lower prices, except the fact is we had the highest oil production under Biden. The prices were still high because it was driven by other things. And he talked about tariffs, which are actually taxes on foreign goods that are coming in. So a lot of the same old. But what I didn't have on my bingo card was him coming after Los Angeles. And I say this as someone, who is evacuated, had a fire, stopped 1 block up from my house in Sierra Madre. He said that no one's done anything. And the first responders, Southern California is not going to love that part of this speech, because we know what thousands of firefighters who've come in from all over the state and even out of state have done. He also then went into this kind of soaring rhetoric, I think intended to bring people together. But then the speech went back to that dark tone. So I actually thought this wasn't maybe as cheery as his team had promoted it. It didn't bring the country together. I don't think you watch that speech and you get to the end of it and you say, yes, we're all in this together.
I had a friend text me during this saying, I feel like this is very dark. I went into this with optimism, and he's saying things like America's decline is over. He said that the election was a mandate to end a horrible betrayal. He promised to put America first. He then listed a series of actions, though, that he plans to put in place right away, declaring an emergency at the southern border. He promised to deploy military assets to the border, increase domestic oil production, as we're talking about. But, also things like gender and race and religion, and using today being Martin Luther King Day as an opportunity to say that we will become a color-blind society. Isaac Hale, what's striking you about kind of this imbalance in ideas here?
I think imbalance is exactly the right word for it. We saw at the end there that President Trump said we were going to be a nation of compassion, but earlier in the speech he called for mass deportation, right? So how do you hold these two ideas together? I think, it's there are some rhetorical contradictions within the speech, and I think we'll have to see at the beginning of the administration how this is going to play out. Certainly, some of the executive orders that we're seeing coming right out of the gate look like they're going to be more on the tougher side of things, including with his planned raids in Chicago, sending the military to the southern border. I think again, you're absolutely correct that there are contradictions in the speech, but I think what we're going to see from this administration is
he doing that on purpose, though? Is that part of the strategy?
Yeah, he's trying to set a more optimistic tone. This was certainly the intention of his team. This is the messaging that we're sending out beforehand, that this was not going to be American Carnage 2.0. This is going to be a more optimistic message. But it also remains the case that he's clearly upset about how he's been treated over the last 4 years. He talked about not using political prosecutions the way he claims that President Biden has, right? Clearly he feels frustrated about the state of the world and wants to take aggressive action. And so these two things, I think, are kind of at odds. A more hopeful, intended more hopeful speech, but clearly some intense and aggressive action coming forward.
And it's hard not to look at the party sitting on the right-hand side of the screen, former Vice President Kamala Harris, former President Biden there, Hillary Clinton, when he's calling it a radical and corrupt administration, calling today Liberation Day, and saying that they couldn't even manage a simple crisis at home. So taking a lot of digs, which was not the most conciliatory messaging.
Yeah, and that dig, I think, was Southern California. And the wildfires, managing a crisis at home, what is he referring to specifically? And then he made it explicit later in the speech. And of course, I mean, we're here, so I'm really focused in on that because Trump is establishing or will likely establish a very troubling precedent, which is the weaponization of FEMA funds during times of crisis. This is something that no Republican or Democratic president should be doing. And so it is highly concerning that he's bringing that up.
It was striking to me that he brought up North Carolina and the victims of the hurricane before he brought up what is happening here in Los Angeles.
And when he brought us up, he blamed it on us not responding to a crisis. I'm sorry, 80 mile per hour winds with fire. If you haven't been up close to that, a firefighter friend told me at over 30 miles per hour, you stop being a firefighter and you are a fire observer. So the idea that this horrific thing that we've just experienced becomes a political talking point, and we're going to see policy following up, the weaponization of FEMA, it does establish a terrible precedence. And there was a lot in this speech too that wasn't necessarily negative, but wasn't on my bingo card. I'll say McKinley, the Gulf of Mexico changing the nickname to the Gulf of America, which Hillary Clinton. There's some video footage of her laughing about that. Mars, the fact that he talked about two genders. These are just not things that I had on my bingo card for a presidential inauguration speech.
Isaac?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think one of the other things that was really interesting, Caroline mentioned seeing the Democrats sitting behind President Trump as he's speaking up here. Back in 2009, Democrats were pretty convinced that they'd assembled a durable, multiracial, working class, middle class coalition for basically a permanent foothold, permanent dominance in American politics going forward. And what we're seeing from President Trump right now is clearly, to some degree, a repudiation of that. And so that was something I was very interested to see at this particular event.
And interestingly, he thanked the Black community, the Hispanic community, who supported him. A lot of them shifted and started supporting him and voted for him. So it was kind of interesting that he brought that into the fold as well.
Yeah, absolutely. I think we're seeing a moment of real shifting alliances in American politics. Now, whether this is any kind of permanent realignment, this is something that we'll have to look back as historians decades from now and see. But certainly, it's an open question whether there's going to be, substantial demographic shifts in the makeup of the parties, or whether this was a one-off repudiation of frustration with the Biden presidency. Biden had extremely low approval numbers at the time where Kamala Harris lost that election bid. So it remains to be seen whether this was frustration among many Americans with the Biden administration or a more permanent realignment in American politics.
Well, that's Caroline. There were a number of things that voters came out and said that they really wanted out of President Trump. Of course, like bringing down the costs of goods, inflation, people really behind tariffs when it comes to China and those types of things. There are the popular points, I think, that he was able to get out and message to people. But some of this, I think people may hear and go, oh, I didn't know that that's what I was voting for.
Well, Donald Trump, he's so interesting, right, in the sense that he doesn't have great support. He's at 51%, right? And when you look at who voted, a third of Americans stayed home. A third of Americans voted for Donald Trump. A third of Americans voted for Kamala Harris. So even though he has all branches of government, his approval ratings are very low. And it'll be interesting to see what he can get through even his Republican Congress, because they have been pretty contentious. But for some of his policies, there's incredible support. This idea of deporting immigrants who are here without papers, who have a criminal record, support for that's 87%. There's also support for banning gender reassignment surgery before the age of 18. There's support for getting out of foreign wars. But then when you look at what he just presented, people don't know what tariffs are. They're about to find out, and I would imagine that their support for that will go down tremendously when they realize that it is a tax on goods coming from other countries, and that it will raise their prices for all goods and services that they use on a daily basis. Also, environmental issues. This drill, baby, drill. The country is not behind that. About 63% of Americans want us less reliant on fossil fuels. So Donald Trump he doesn't have a mandate, and he is walking a very fine line with some of these more controversial issues. But he does have support with the other branches of government in both houses of Congress. So if he can manage to kind of wrangle the cats who have been so dissenting on the Republican side in Congress, he will pass policies that run against the grain of what a majority of Americans want.
Professor Hale, any last thoughts?
Yeah, I would just add that while the Republican Party is substantially more unified around President Trump than they were during his first term, it's also important to note that his congressional majority is much narrower. Republicans had a 50-seat majority in the House of Representatives in 2017. That majority is in single digits now. So if we think back to the speaker's fight that led to Californian Kevin McCarthy losing his position as Speaker of the House of Representatives in 2023, well, this shows that there are fissures within the Republican Party coalition, and those fissures may be a problem for Donald Trump as he pursues his legislative agenda, particularly with such a narrow majority.
Well, it is day one. We have 4 years to go. Caroline Heldman and Isaac Hale, thank you both so much for being with us to discuss all of this from Occidental College. And we'll have you stick around just in case we continue this conversation. But